The book it's a generational epic. It follows a Chinese American immigrant family as they move to a homestead in South Dakota. In my mind, in the 1970s ish. And it kind of follows them through three generations as they build a life. They fall in love. They try to figure out what it's like to grow old, to have kids of your own. And while that is happening, the U.S. government has installed a nuclear missile silo on their property, and they begin working on it. And strange things begin happening throughout. And I think ultimately, for me, it's a book about, I mean, death. I think, but also about what it means to spend time with one another and to kind of mark the hour and to know that we're all kind of getting old at the same time. I grew up in New York City, and I like so I live in Iowa now. I teach at the University of Iowa. This is my first time out in kind of properly rural settings, right? And it's not even that rural. It's a college town. Like the rural area is beyond, if you drive in a direction, you can get there. But I've always been really fascinated by the way that like nature can keep time. Because one thing that I think was unusual that I didn't realize was unusual about growing up as a city kid was that like the built environment doesn't really respond to winter in the same way, right? Like all of the interior spaces are air conditioned or heated. There's a way in which like large cities or the built environment in general, I think, is interested in denying that they are places in the world, that they are places in nature and affected by it. Whereas here, like I think everything feels so permeable to nature and to time. Ultimately, wanted to write about, I'm really interested in nature. But South Dakota became the site of my interest because I have driven cross country a bunch of times. And every time when I get to South Dakota, I feel just like total awe at the landscape. And part of it is like the Badlands, which if you haven't gone, I recommend everyone on earth go to the Badlands. But just in general, like to kind of visit this place that was so large, but also like that grandness of scale hadn't actually taken away any of like the smallest details. Like you could stop anywhere and just keep looking, and it would like continue opening itself up for you. And ultimately, my PhD work was in nuclear missiles and science fiction, and so I had all this kind of like research that I had already done on nuclear missiles, and I ended up thinking about the book as a way of approaching those same questions, but without having to work on my dissertation. I'm interested in the way that science fiction and popular culture ends up determining or playing a role in developing like these crazy technologies that no one's ever heard of. My argument is that there's only really one mode of cognition that we have for us when we think about things that are impossible or improbable or far future. And that's the mode of science fiction that allows us to kind of import stuff that hasn't happened into the present and then start working on them. And so my object of study was the first nuclear missile, the Atlas ICBM. And I traced how it was kind of developed by these people who grew up reading Buck Rogers, like all the 1920s science fiction. It gave them like a common language that they could use to speak to one another, and it influenced even the way that they drew the missile in their proposals was like with like comic book styling and like lines, and to kind of just trace not only the role of science fiction in how technologies get brought about, but also to give us a charge for ourselves, which is that like we should not consume blindly, right? Like that the way that we think about the future and the way that we tell stories, especially in science fiction, have real resonance and consequence with what we decide to do in our own futures. We absolutely can affect the natural world, right? Like it presses back on us, right? And like our activities, like not even as individuals, but I think like the scale at which we operate as a species can actually do something to nature, right? It can cause like climate change. Like we've built the nuclear missiles, right, which can bring about the end of nature, for all intents and purposes. And yet it's like there's this kind of perpetual sense of like not quite being there, or like not you're never in the room, you're never at the helm. You along with everyone else, along with all of the world, is drawn along by these forces that are kind of beyond your control or understanding. And I think there's like a parallel that I'm interested in between like the forces of state and the forces of nature. That like when things get so large, they become kind of the same thing, which is like an inscrutable intelligence that seems to be animating decisions, but which is totally closed to you. Farming is of course totally subject to the whims of natural calamity, right? Like a hailstorm can wipe out like an entire year's worth of corn. And the way that we have decided to deal with that is by erecting other structures that don't exist right in human society, like insurance or like this idea that like we could value your loss, which struck me as just like kind of applying another human construction to this kind of first human construction, which is that like we care specifically about these plants here. We don't want them to be destroyed by hail, but the hailstorm that destroys your crops also destroys other plants. It destroys everything. And so there's a way in which like we the management of risk or like the thinking about death in kind of regular life becomes this lens through which we are unable to read the actual kind of like carelessness or the implacable march of destruction and time out there, because here it's insured and it's protected and we have contracts, mitigating that. And then out there in the field, stuff just happens. Stuff just gets destroyed. Weather comes along. Like the hailstorm knows not the market value of the corn it shreds, right? But we do, and that's why it matters to us. The idea that you could be betrayed by the passing of seasons, I think for me is a sense that when you're grieving, the world seems to stop, and I think the thing that catches you by surprise is that like everyone else has kept going, that your grief is not universal, and that what you're feeling, the intensity of what you're feeling, and the extent to which it has come to totally terraform your life over these past however many months or years is actually happening at the same rate that everyone else is going through life. That there is a sense in which no one has waited for you, and no one has kind of put their hand on the throttle and given you a break. That stuff happens regardless of whether you're paying attention. And I think it's a feeling of being out of time and then coming back into it, right? Of being betrayed that people have been living while you were not, or while you were grieving. I think for Saul, that is the thing which is most upsetting, right? Like not like he can understand betrayal by people, because people are fickle and they can be cruel, and he knows that. I think the thing that really stuns him is that he could feel this kind of depth of emotion and be presented with this totally unperturbed time, right? That the seasons have still gone on, that stuff has still gotten older. No amount of feeling in himself will ever push out and stop time or slow it. There are stories my parents will tell me about their childhood, and that feels, I feel like if I wanted to, I could challenge them. I could say, well, like, was that really, but that effect seems to wane as I hear older and older stories, right? And by the time my grandmother is telling me stories about when she was a child, right, which would have been 100 years ago, it feels like inviolable, right? Like that there is no truth value that I can bring. That it's not even the point that I'm interested in what really did happen or how things really did go. And I think it's the effect of stuff being so old that it matters that it made it. Not even that it's true or that it's verifiable or that it's a piece of history. It's simply powerful because it is a narrative kind of fragment which is lived for so long. So I was born in Beijing. I was always nervous to write about kind of Chinese stories or like the stories that I had in my family, because for a long time, I was worried that I was getting them wrong, or that I needed to understand Chinese history, or I needed to read all these books, and I did. But ultimately, I realized I don't have an equal grasp of American history, right? And I'm perfectly willing to tell stories about America, and I think that there's a sense in which it has really been freeing to think that, oh, these stories are valuable because they're stories, not because that they offer testimonial to a historical event, or because they're rooted in an understanding of the geopolitical situation of the time. They're interesting simply because they're my family stories, and they're 100 years old. And whether or not they're verifiable or true, they are here. And that's what I'm interested in kind of talking about. It's very upsetting to think of your life as merely a series of kind of contingent random events with no causal connection. This kind of like class 4 rapids that you've just been white knuckling it through for no good reason, without any intervention of your own. And so I think we do reach for narrative, or the kind of that basic claim of I did this and then this thing happened because I did that. and then I dealt with the consequences of that action. I think that basic lie of narrative, right, which is a lie because I mean it is a truth. We're all just kind of dragged along this random churn of so society and interaction. And I think that as people get older, at least I'm not that old yet, I don't think, but as as my grandparents think back on their stories in their very early life, it feels like it has more weight because they have this causal chain that extends from when my grandmother was weaving straw mats, as a 6 year old to where she is now and she's painting, right? And I think I can see the logic of weaving in her art. Like, is it really there? I think that has kind of ceased to matter, right? Like, what is more important is that like this person here embodies some kind of mystical pastness, which I'll accept anything for, right? Coincidences seem magical. Everything seems magical if you wait long enough. You can do that as a writer. You can introduce something which is random and contingent, and then over the course of other random contingent events, you can invest that with meaning. You can take something which is meaningless and just by keeping it around long enough, have it begin to mean something. And what exactly that might mean, I think, is that sometimes it felt difficult to say, and I would go through many drafts and kind of try to work down through it. But I think ultimately the thing that was interesting was that like chrysanthemums, for instance, like they became meaningful because they were there the whole time. And at the end, I kind of had this, I was kind of obligated to go back to the beginning and then amplify the things that had come out at the end, right? I have this magical power of authorship, which lets me move back and forth through the narrative until everything lines up and works together. But I think ultimately, throughout the narrative, it's just you can keep stuff around and you can watch it get old in story, which is very cool. It was useful for me to map out the chronology of the novel and then kind of disregard it. A reader who was exactly me, who had all of the knowledge that I had, would probably be able to figure out when everything was. Like they'd be able to count the years from the Ashfall, which is Mount St. Helens, and kind of work their way forward and backward. But for me, I actually wanted to replicate that feeling of like you hear a story that someone tells you and you go, oh, when was this? And they don't know. That is what interested me, is that our lives go on and we're within time and we're affected by it, but we're also in a really kind of genuine sense unmoored from time. Right. Like I think part of that was why COVID was so weird, is it brought us all instantaneously to the exact same time. There are events which by their magnitude or their kind of inevitability, which seem to kind of like force us all to be on the same page just for a little bit, but it's weird and it's uncomfortable, right? But like most of the time we keep our own time. We think, oh, when I was younger, right? Or oh, this was before, when I still had baby teeth or something like that. And then someone goes, when was that? And you go, oh, it must have been, right? And I think that's the effect that I was interested in, was that it must have been. Or we could figure out when it happened, but really this is a story that takes place for me, proper time.